We all belong outside. We're drawn to nature, whether it's the recorded sounds of the ocean we doze off to, or the succulents that adorn our homes. Nature makes all of our lives, well, better. Despite all this, we often go about our busy lives removed from it. But the outdoors is closer than we realize. With AllTrails, you can discover trails nearby and explore confidently. With offline maps and on-trail navigation, download the free app today and make the most of your summer with AllTrails.
I'm going to pass you the ball. Have you received it, sir?
I've received it, thank you.
Thank you.
Controlled it effortlessly.
Oh, fantastic. And the voice you can hear, guys, is that of Jon Spurling, who's wrote a fantastic book, Get It On, How the 70s Rock Football. So welcome, John, and welcome all to Book Corner Extra Time.
Thanks, Gabbie. Thank you for having me on.
I love the front cover, and I want to talk about the front cover first. Sheer joy, Patrick Barclay. Fascinating, funny and poignant, Henry Winter, two of the top writers. That must have been fantastic for them boys to pass that praise on to you.
Yeah, it was. I mean, you know, when you ask people to take a look at the book and hopefully provide a kind of nice pre-publication quote, you know, you take a bit of a gamble, don't you? Because It was the first time that anyone, apart from my editor, had actually really looked at it. So you take your life into your own hands in that respect. I was thrilled by what came back from Patrick and Henry, and as you say, you know, you've got Guillaume Balaguer and Amy Lawrence as well on there. So yeah, I was very, very pleased by that. And you know, for me as well, one of the joys of writing the book was that Barry Davies agreed to write the foreword as well, because for me, Barry Davies is the yardstick by which all other football commentators should be judged. And when he wrote the foreword, I was thrilled to bits. There's certain things about this book which, as you know, as you might tell from reading it, I thoroughly enjoyed writing this book, and getting Barry Davies to agree to write the foreword was probably the one of the best parts, as well as getting the pre-publication blurb off writers who are far more successful and far more well known than me. So I was very pleased with that.
What is your back catalogue? I mean, in your background, you're an Arsenal fan, aren't you? And you have written books before. This isn't your first book, is it?
No, this is my seventh book actually. Yeah. So I've written books mostly on Arsenal. I wrote the history of Highbury N5. I wrote that when they left Highbury to move to the Emirates. I wrote Rebels for the Cause, which also ironically has Charlie George on the front of it as well, the same as this one. And I've written a World Cup book. But you know, I've been a freelance football writer for 25 years, and this one, as in Get It On, I've had on the back burner for 25 years, and I've done interviews, as you can see, way back as far as about 1997, I think I started. So I'd had the interviews, but I could never quite pull it together in a structure. But eventually I got there. Lockdown kind of like nudged me in the right direction with that, like I think it did a lot of authors. And we finally got it over the line, but 25 years it took to from my starting to think about it to finishing it.
How long did it take you to draw up the artwork? I love the way Get It On is written in kind of orange on the black. It really works. Jon Spurling, your name is like green on the black. It really works. How the 70s Rock Football, the title, it really works. I love the writing of it. It just looks, when you look at that book in a shop, it just says, pick me up and buy me and then read me, because it's a fantastic, it really is a fantastic cover. That's where we're starting.
Yeah, I mean, that one is a bit of a combination between me and the publishers, really, because I suggested the 70s writing that is, you know, the triple spoke style, because that's how what ITV did for their 1970 World Cup coverage. So if you look back at YouTube, the font is like that. So that was me, but it's the publishers who came up with the kind of the burnt orange and brown colouring. Because if you look back at photos when you were kids, or for your listeners, if you're this, this is mainly sort of fans of 1970s football, maybe parents' photos. The 70s was the era of burnt orange and brown.
Yeah.
And I think the in terms of carpets and wallpaper and decor and that sort of thing, and I think the cover screams 1970s at you, even before you look at what's going on in the actual photo.
It certainly also screams, let's have a ruck, because on the front of it, you've got Terry. I'm not too sure. It looks as though he's having a pop at Charlie. It looks like Peter Story, and I don't know who the other Arsenal player is in the background, just behind the arms. And I did say to Terry's brother Kenny, I didn't realise your kid was a bit of a scrapper. And he said, Gab, he was a bit fiery, was Terry. I love him, but he was a bit fiery. He's a Bradford lad, isn't he?
He was. That's Bob McNabb. So you've got Peter Story on the left, cold eyes or snouty. You've got Charlie George on the right, as you say, and Bob McNabb. And for that again, the publishers found this one. I think it's an amazing photo, because it sums up the title, getting it on in terms of having a brawl, having a fight, because it's a very, very combative decade. Obviously, it's in homage to the song, my favourite song from the 70s, by T-Rex. But also, it's about getting it on the telly. And I think that the book talks about the beginning of the era of coloured TV, which elevates football to a different level. But if you look closely, obviously at the front cover, you've got all the rubbish on the pitch, presumably bits of toilet roll, which used to fly around, didn't it, at will during 1970s matches.
It certainly did. There was never any toilet roll in the toilets at 70s matches, because they were all thrown on. I mean, now if you're in Argentina, they throw hand grenades on the pitch. We in the 70s threw toilet rolls.
That's right.
But
There's so many. You watch it footage, just so many toilet rolls flying around, and there's so much rubbish on the pitch, either paper or mainly toilet roll. I'm amazed that anyone had any left.
Absolutely. You referenced T-Rex and Get It On, one of the great artists of the 70s. And Get It On got to number one on the 24th of July 1971, and it was their second number one, wasn't it? Mark Bolan was an absolute legend. In fact, the tree that the car hit, because it was Gloria that was driving the car, wasn't it? Mark was the passenger.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Alan Hudson, a few years before that, got breathalyzed under that tree. It was not far from where Huddy used to live in Wimbledon. Right? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I mean, Mark Bolan. It's because I interviewed Terry O'Neill, the photographer, and Mark Bolan apparently always wanted his hair like George Best's, but Terry O'Neill had to point out that unfortunately Mark Bolan's was too curly for him to have a full bestie. So that never happened, sadly. But a lot of musicians, I mean, what I found out also was that although he was no football fan, David Bowie was a big fan of Peter Osgood in the way that he would hold himself and conduct himself and with a swagger. Yeah. There's a bit of overlap between glam rock and football. Down to the long hair and the kind of camera hogging habits that footballers started to get in the 70s, I think.
I've always said to the boys, because I've done 19 interviews now of 70s football players, and a regular podcast to do with Alan Hudson and Terry Curran, and I always say to the boys that all the footballers wanted to be rock stars, and the rock stars wanted to be footballers. And to be fair, the footballers were the rock stars back in those days. Yeah. They were in Lucky, and they were in Shoot magazine, they were in every Jackie magazine. They were on the front cover of everything, the footballers, and especially our Maverick players, and Charlie being one of them. He lost a finger in a lawnmower accident, didn't he, Charlie? Bless him.
He did. I think that was when he was at Southampton. That was later on in the 70s. Yeah, but it is, and it's such a visual age, isn't it? I mean, the footballers started. We're talking 10 years, aren't we, after the ending of the maximum wage for footballers, in the early 60s. So by the 70s, if you're a top flight footballer, you're earning a tidy amount. I think I worked out from talking to a few of them, and Peter Osgood, I think they were on what will be around now about 75,000 a year. A tidy wage, definitely, but not enough to kind of catapult them out of the orbit of average, normal football fans. And I think that's probably because in the book, I don't claim that the 70s was necessarily a golden era in every way. You've got the hooliganism, you've got racism, you've got the stadium not in great shape. But I think what is attractive about 70s football is it's probably more of a level playing field, and the players themselves have more in common with the fans that watch them than they do today. But it's certainly getting more visual in the sense that you're seeing them, as you say, on magazine covers. Terry O'Neill takes that famous picture, the Clan, which Huddy, as you mentioned, was in. Alan Hudson was in that, wasn't he? Rodney Marsh as well, Jeff Hurst, David Webb as well. And it represents them how much more swagger, if you like, top flight footballers are having or getting, if you like, by the time the 70s come around.
Absolutely. And the panel for the 1970 World Cup that we just touched upon earlier, that was iconic because it was groundbreaking, wasn't it? Because it was just the BBC, and I love the story in the book about the cup final ruck. And it wasn't the players, it wasn't the fans, it was the TV companies, wasn't it?
That's right. I mean, Barry Davis now calls it the punch-up final because the expectation was that BBC was the more established, obviously, of the two broadcasters, and BBC claimed that they had a monopoly over interviews. Well, they did before the game, but they didn't after the game, and ITV thought that they would move in. So Malcolm Allison was signed up by ITV, who later became part of the panel and was coach in the final. And he gave the ITV crew smuggled in some tracksuits and a wheelie bin, and then the ITV crew sat incognito on the Manchester City bench. And then when the final whistle went, they made a move for Neil Young, who scored the winner in the '69 Cup final for Manchester City. And all hell broke loose. I mean, one of the guys got a broken tooth. The studio guys, their plugs were pulled out, camera lens smashed, and it really set the scene. And I think Jimmy Hill, who was controller, was kind of sports in charge of sports at LWT, realised that ITV were onto something, and so him and John Bromley at ITV decided to start looking at other ways that they could trump BBC, and one of their ways was by putting together this amazing panel for the 1970 World Cup of Malcolm Allison, Bob McNabb, Pat Crerar and Derek Dougan, and Jimmy Hill himself appeared, all shepherded by a pipe smoking headmasterly Brian Moore. But I mean, it heralded the dawning of a more flashy breed of kind of baby boom footballer, if you like. It was the way the panel spoke to each other, minus the swearing, perhaps, was much how football fans spoke to each other down the pub, and that had never been seen before, because the BBC was always quite kind of stuffed shirt and traditional, whereas the panel was like a breath of fresh air. And Malcolm Allison smoked on air. He was racking up a massive bar bill, so he'd often go on having drunk champagne. And Brian Moore talked about the exotic aftershaves wafting around. He described it as the kind of scent of early 70s man, which I think summed it up quite nicely, actually, in that studio.
I think Brian done a fantastic job keeping all those egos together, because there was not just a lot of aftershave wafting around, there was a lot of testosterone wafting around there as well, because they were big boys, weren't they? And I don't mean in size, but when you're looking at Jimmy Hill, absolute pioneer, when you're looking at Big Mel, one of the most charismatic managers and coaches, and not just 70s, of all time. Derek Dougan was no shrinking violet. In fact, it was Derek that introduced the shirt logos, wasn't it? The advertising on the shirts, Kettering tyres.
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
then
no,
he
exactly.
and then he had to take it off, but he put KT, and he tried to convince the authorities it was Kettering Town, not Kettering Tyres. And
Yeah,
Paddy Crelland, what a character Paddy was as well, and Bob, of course, would have been out there, but he didn't quite make the cut, so he was back giving the players analysis. So it was a very iconic panel, and some of
yeah,
them stayed over then in 1974. Incredibly,
that's right.
okay, England didn't qualify. We won the World Cup in '66 under a Labour government, and Wilson always used to bring that out, didn't he? That England are very successful with a Labour government, but when we got beaten 70, it brought the government down.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. I mean, Harold Wilson spent much of the later 60s kind of courting the Beatles and George
Yeah.
Best because he wanted to appeal to younger voters.
Mm,
He's not the last politician to try and appeal to younger voters through sport and music, is he?
no.
And he famously said after 66, have you noticed that England only ever win the World Cup when there's a Labour government? So in 1970, yeah, he put a lot of thought into when the election would be, and he plumped for the kind of day, was it day or 2 days after
Yeah.
the quarter final
Hmm.
against West Germany. Well, he was convinced that had England won, they were 2-0 up, weren't they, against West
Yeah.
Germany, he'd have won the election. But obviously, Gerd Muller scored the winner at 3-2. And yeah, I mean, Wilson was convinced that because of that defeat, people became more introspective and started to think, well, if we're no longer champions of the world, what does that say about the state of England as a country? And yeah, he thought it made people more introspective, and it was kind of for people maybe the start of declinism. In other words, thinking that maybe things were better in the past, and in football, I guess that was the case with the World Cup. But I think, to be honest with you, I spoke to quite a few players like Jack Charlton and Brian LeBone and and Alan Ball about it, and they didn't buy it. I mean, Brian LeBone, who was Everton captain, was I think he went to uni, and I think he was into economics in quite a big way.
Yeah.
And he said, no, it's because a couple of days before the election, there was the balance of payments was proved to be in deficit, and what it showed is that Labour wasn't necessarily handling the economy as well as they claimed they were. And in general elections, it's normally about the economy, isn't it? That's what normally makes or breaks a government. But no, Harold Wilson was convinced to the end of his life that 70 World Cup cost him the election.
But he did get back in, didn't he? The government after Ted
Yeah,
Heath had to go, he took us into
yeah, he did.
Europe. And when we're looking at Europe, England football team's done a great job of conquering Europe in the 70s, didn't they?
Well, they did. I mean, that's the remarkable thing, that as it's almost like an inverse law. As quickly as the England national team declined, English clubs in Europe did really well. I mean, several clubs, Arsenal, Leeds, Tottenham won. The Liverpool won UEFA Cups, and Fairs Cups, as it was called. And then, of course, at the end of the decade, you had Nottingham Forest winning under Cloughy, and Bob Paisley leading Liverpool to the European Cup. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I'm going to cover it perhaps more in the 1980
Yeah.
80s follow up to this. But why was it that at the time where England, the national team, struggled, the teams in Europe did well? And Clough was of the opinion that there are fewer variables in club football. You have your squad. In England, you can pick from a wider pool of players. The manager picks the team, and if you're England boss, you can often be swayed by what the press think. And I think that's what Don Revie's issue was, that at Leeds everything was fixed. Nothing ever changed. Right down to the players. Whereas at England, you never seem to quite know the best style, the best players, or what he was doing. And for someone who was so set in their ways at Leeds, he was then the exact opposite as England manager. It's strange. But yeah, it's true that English clubs did very well in Europe in the 70s.
I think you're right. I think the dynamics of managing a club team compared to a international side are completely different. Whereas Don,
Yeah,
those Leeds players were all his family. They were like
Yeah.
his sons, and he would play. They would have karaoke nights. They would have carpet bowls and bingo, etc.
Yeah.
But when he tried to bring that to the national team with the Maverick
Mm.
players that we got, Alan Hudson, Frank Worthington, Alan Baller, go down Millionaires Row and talk to Bernie Winters rather
Mm.
than go and play the carpet bowls. It didn't
Yeah.
work. Don was
No.
spoilt for choice and he didn't really know what to do. But what he did do is that he had a get together at an England training camp and he told Rodney Marsh, Tony Curry, Alan Hudson, Stan Bowles, and Frank Worthington that they were no longer part of his plan. Now, when
Yeah.
you put those players and say, look, you're no longer in my plans, and
Yeah.
also Ramsey was no fan of the Maverick player as well.
No.
And I think that
No.
when you look at the talent that England had, that both Ramsey and Reevy overlooked, and you could
Yeah.
argue a little bit that Ron Greenwood brought back, he certainly brought back Tony Curry because Tony only
Yeah.
played the one game, Switzerland away under
Mm.
Reevy.
Yeah.
Alan played 2 games under Reevy. Supermax scored 5 goals and was never seen again.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
incredible.
It is. It is incredible. That's right. I mean, that I think runs right through the book. The kind of tension between the new breed of footballer, born, after World War II. That they didn't live through the Great Depression. They haven't done national service,
Mm.
and so you've got the new baby boom, if you like, footballer born after World War II, in conflict, if you like, with old school managers
Yeah,
who don't really understand them.
yeah,
As I think Rob Steen said it, who wrote an excellent book called The Mavericks,
yeah,
that they wore their non-conformity as a badge of honor. They wanted to do their own thing. They were entertainers. Rodney Marsh said, he was more keen on entertaining the crowd than actually ensuring that Manchester City, say, won the league in '72, and he was never going to change. Whereas Ramsey and Revie were absolutely team men, and they were all consumed with winning rather than style. Now, it's difficult, isn't it? Because obviously Ramsey won the World Cup, Revie won multiple trophies with Leeds, but you get the impression they were as men they were very, very uptight. Down from with the way Ramsey spoke to Revie's superstitions, and you almost felt had they relaxed a little bit, and perhaps relaxed the Mavericks, if you like, when they were around them, things might have turned out differently.
yeah. I think 100%.
But neither the Mavericks nor Ramsey or Revie were ever going to change. All in their different ways. They're very, very stubborn, aren't they?
Yeah, I think that
Convinced they're right.
you are what you are, aren't you? You have that persona, and you have that. When you look at some of the managers, I mean, Reevy was the one because for me, the greatest team of the '70s. I know Liverpool won more, but I think
Mm,
Shankly and Reevy, I think they won the same amount of cups, if I remember rightly. For
mm,
me, Leeds United are the greatest team that I've ever seen in my lifetime. And I look at it in the way that Leeds team had everything. If you wanted to play football, they'd play football.
yeah,
If you wanted to fight them, they'd outfight you. And they were a fantastic group of players. In
yeah.
those days, we didn't carry the squads that we do, say, for instance, Manchester City do today with 30 internationals.
No,
And
that is absolutely true.
Leeds were fighting on all fronts. When I'd done an interview with Alan Clark and I was talking to Sniffer, and he says, yeah, but Paul, we were going for the treble pretty much every season. And I think
Yeah,
that's what Reevy was trying to do. He wanted
yeah,
to win everything, but then when he went to manage England, he just he he. he lost his way. I would suggest Revie lost his way because his
yeah,
philosophy of football changed. Where had it not changed, then he would have been successful.
yeah. That's right. No, that's right. And I think also, but when Leeds won the title in '74, I think that he did realise that actually perhaps Leeds had played with the shackles on in terms of style, And that Leeds team of '74 was fantastically entertaining and scored lots of goals on the way. But it was almost they're mud sticks, isn't it? And they were still called dirty Leeds, even though actually their disciplinary record in '74 improved a great deal. And even Brian Clough, Revy's mortal enemy, if you like, admitted that their style in '74 had been better.
Yeah, I think again, I think it's almost a myth, and to this day, you'll still see on social media, dirty Leeds, but
Yeah,
all the teams had hard men in the
yeah,
midst. I mean,
yeah.
people will say,
Arsenal did.
yeah,
Yeah,
Johnny Giles, he was a silent assassin. Yeah, but Johnny Giles had his ankle and his leg broke against
yeah,
Johnny Watts at Birmingham City and Eddie McCready at Chelsea. Now,
yeah.
there was no greater hatchet man than Ron Chopper Harris. Peter
No,
Storey was no shrinking violet. You got Norman Bite Your Legs Hunter. But it was almost as though in the 70s, where I think you're right, the colour TV was coming in, football was a whole new ball game. I know for lots of people they think it started in '92, but it started in 1888. The Football League did, but
yeah,
it was just getting to the cameras and match of the day, and they was
yeah.
almost trying to sell the game by giving tags to football clubs and players. And lovely chaps that you wrote talking of tags. Paul Trevelyan literally did give the tags to Don, didn't
Yeah.
he?
Have you interviewed Paul?
It took me 37 minutes to get a word in with Paul.
Yeah.
Absolute,
He, yeah.
absolute legend. I did private
Yeah.
message Steve Perryman and said, Steve, absolute respect. I think it took you 25 minutes to get a word in, but Steve
Blimey.
is
Yeah.
twice, three times, 10 times the
But
person that
what
I am.
amazing stories Paul Trevelyan has
Legend.
to tell. I mean, he started off trying to, because Paul Trevelyan, I don't know if your listeners know the full story. If they listen to your show, they will. But he worked for Mark McCormick, the
Yeah,
cartoonist, the visual artist out in America. And when he was out in America, he started to go to American sports. I think he went to the Cleveland Indians. And what he
yeah,
saw is that their approach to sport was very different from English football. So they'd give out free caps, biros. They'd have events, dances, dancing troops on the pitch beforehand. They'd have tailgate parties in the car park. He said, this is nothing like English football. So he went to Bill Nicholson at Tottenham and said, I'd like to introduce some ideas, because he knew him, because Paul Trevelyan was a big Tottenham fan and grew up around that area. And Bill Nicholson said no. He said, we're not Tiller girls, thanks, Paul. But a mate of mine is Don Revie, and Don Revie was always very, very commercially aware. Because I don't know if we're going to go on and talk about this, but he also
absolutely.
embraced Admiral,
Yeah,
the replica kit craze as well. So Paul Trevelyan managed to convince the most hard-bitten squad in football, and ruthlessly professional, and Don Revie, to introduce sock tags, target balls, choreographed warm-up routines as well. And it took a while. I mean, in the book, I talk about when Jack Charlton basically tried to bodily remove him when he was
yeah,
trying to talk. But in the end, Jack Charlton came around to the idea, because I think that Leeds players realised that it was time that they probably embraced the more aesthetic, a more kind of joyful side of the game. And Paul Trevelyan, he got the guy who produced Tom Jones's records. What was his name?
Les
What's
Reed.
his name? Les
Les
Reed,
Reed.
thank you.
Mm.
Yeah, to produce Leeds' 1972 FA Cup final record. So they had a lot of fun with Paul Trevelyan, and much of what Trevelyan's ideas were, a bit more razzmatazz around the game, is part and parcel, excuse me, of football today. And I think Revie realised that, but he then put a break on Trevelyan at the end of '72, because he thought it was going, a bit far. But then Revie was approached by Bert Patrick from Admiral, who convinced him that he could do with some work and some modernisation, if you like, of Leeds' yellow away kit. And so, you had Admiral's first major intake or instep into the replica kit world was with Leeds United, where they had the stripes going down the arms and that kind of thing. And obviously the Admiral revolution took off. And then when Revie took over England, Admiral did England's kit there as well, with the blue and red tram lines going down the arms, which was quite controversial in some quarters, because likes of Emlyn Hughes and Alan Ball reckoned that it was more British than English. So Revie was, for people who say he's stuck in his ways, well, he might have known what he liked in football, in terms of the football played, but he was also commercially very, very modernist, I think, and very, very attuned to what was going on.
Absolutely, and also the self-belief, because Don was very, very superstitious, wasn't he? And
Yeah,
when they first had the sock tags, Don wasn't going to go with it because he thought that it made Leeds look a little bit silly. And when Paul turned up, he said, we're not going with it, Paul." And he said, "Well, why?" And he told him, he says, "Don, you're a loser. Don, you're a loser, Don, you're a loser. I'm going to go out there, I'm going to tell the first Leeds United player that you're a loser." When I exactly, he said, when I spoke to Dixie, and I was talking to Dixie, and I said to Dixie, "Did you doubt yourself when you scored 3 goals against Arsenal to give you 60 league goals in the season? George Campbell scored 59, but that was in the 2nd division. Did you self-doubt?" And Dixie said, "Paul, you wouldn't be in my team. You're a loser." So it was almost Dixie Dean talking through Paul Trevelyan to Don Revie, and Don then backed down and the sock tags, and it was almost as though it was a comfort blanket as well, if you like, that they were clinging on to something, because he was giving them that self-belief and saying, you're going to win the FA Cup, you adopt this, you're going to win the FA Cup. He told the Tottenham players that they're going to win the double, and Bill Nicholson had a pop at him because the season before they didn't. But again, he installed not just the brands and things like you've alluded to, but he put that self-belief in there as well.
Yeah, he's incredible talker, Paul Trevelyan is. And Jack Charlton said, he spoke so quickly they could barely understand what he said. But his whole thing, wasn't it, that Leeds were a great team and he wanted to rebrand them into Super Leeds. So I think the thing is, what I haven't mentioned as well is the names on the back of the tracksuits, which it's just par for the course these days, isn't it? But back then, having names on the back of the tracksuits, wow, that's new, that's modern. So I think much of what Paul Trevelyan, or the Beaver, to give him his 70s moniker there, is introduced is what we take for granted now. And I'm really pleased in the book, actually. Paul did a couple of photos for me. I'm just opening, I've got a copy in front of me now, where he's there with his sock, his target ball, in the bag, because obviously they're more than 50 years old now. I think he's scared it'll perish if it comes out. But also his Norman Hunter themed shin pads, the bites your legs shin pads. But unfortunately that never got beyond the prototype stage. But it's a shame, isn't it? Imagine Norman Hunter going out in those onto the pitch.
Absolutely, but Terry Cooper designed a boot as well, didn't he?
Yeah.
There was so many things going on, and Trevelyan was really in the thick of it. I mean, Jimmy Hill was in the thick of it as well, because, of course, Jimmy rebranded Coventry City with the Sky Blue Revolution, and Big Mal rebranded Crystal Palace. So the 70s
Big Mal at Crystal Palace. I mean, that should be that's worthy of a movie.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure a lot of your listeners will know that Big Mal jumped in the team bath with Fiona Richmond, who was Paul Raymond's muse in Soho. But he also arranged a match between the Planet of the Apes 11 and a team of Playboy bunnies.
Yeah.
The photos are online. It sounds too crazy to be true. But that was Malcolm Allison. I think Jim Cannon, the Palace captain, said no other manager could take a team to 2 successive relegations, but still be regarded there as a cult hero because he redesigned the kit, didn't he? They were once the Glaziers, weren't they? The
Yeah, they were.
Glaziers,
Yeah.
not the Glazers, the Glaziers. And they suddenly became the Eagles. So yeah, rebranding is going on in several areas in the 70s. It is a cutting edge decade in many ways as well.
I think it's the biggest cutting edge decade that we've known in football. I know that these days, replica kits, they change every season, and now teams have 3 or 4. But back then they were just coming out. They were at the cusp of everything. Football was changing, and the managers and the coaches and the players were there doing it in real time. And 3 great examples there of management that were doing that. And then you had other managers, of course, with Shankly and Brian Clough. I mean, Cloughie with he was on everything, was he? Michael Parkinson and Muhammad Ali was there, and he was like, Clough, I've had enough. He's like, what are you going to do, Brian? I want to fight him. But that was Cloughie.
That was him.
Cloughie was probably the biggest maverick of the 70s.
Well, I think before I wrote the book, I thought long and hard about it, and I said to my editor, I said, "What am I going to go with this?" And I went with it. And what my view is that Brian Clough.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Was not just the biggest football personality of the 70s, he was the biggest personality of the 70s, full stop.
Absolutely.
Because he was, like you just said, on and in everything. He was a pundit with ITV. He had a Daily Express column. He was on The Ball, which was the ITV's lunchtime football, preview program, their version of Football Focus.
Brilliant show.
He was impersonated by Mike Yarwood, who in those days had audiences of 22 million because obviously there's only 3 channels. He was, as you say, he was on Frost, he was on Parkinson. His Leeds career began and ended on Calendar with the former Labour MP Austin Mitchell. I really don't think there's a politician or a pop star or an Israeli spoon bender like Uri Geller who had a higher profile in the 70s than Brian Clough. I really don't, because he realised that the platform football could offer him. He was on multimedia platforms everywhere in a pre-digital age. He was literally everywhere, wasn't he?
Yeah, and they were doing it, as I say, in real time. As it was evolving, the management and the coaches and the players were all evolving with the game, and there was such a shape shift of football, and I think more so in that decade than any other decade. But again, Clough, he won the league with Derby. He then, at the end of the decade, he won the league with Nottingham Forest, and then the European Cup. He was very unlucky not to win the European Cup with Derby County.
A notorious match with Juventus, where he felt that, as he said, that describes the Italians as cheats or words to that effect. I mean, there was a while where Brian Clough said, I don't think he was genuinely thinking of, but he almost decided to leave football and go and join ITV as their kind of main football person, if you like. I'm not sure that he ever would have seriously done that, because I think to his core, it was a football man. But he perhaps more than anyone embraced punditry and the media. No football manager has probably done that since. I don't
No,
think.
no. And the
I
way that
really
he would,
don't.
the way that Cloughie talked to the media as
Yeah,
well,
yeah,
you people, because he always talked down at them, didn't he? Always talked
yeah,
down at the media, and even with Match of the Day, what you need to do is less of that and more football. And then
yeah,
when the Sky was coming on, I mean, Cloughie, in those days, he was not the Brian Clough that he was in the early days when he was so very successful. But he'd
yeah,
say, "You people, what you're going to do? You're going to run football." And it's the people's game. Cloughie was a massive socialist that
yeah,
believed in simple things, and his Nottingham Forest and Derby County teams both played the passing game, a simple game. Cloughie'd say there's grass up there on the clouds. You play football, but it's down on the floor, so that's where
yeah,
you play football, on the
yeah.
deck.
That's right. I mean, what's interesting is I obviously watched a lot of football when I was writing this book, and some of the football, to be fair, hasn't really stood the test of time. It's quite agricultural and quite clunky. But I tell you, who still looks amazing is Clough's Derby team from '72.
Yeah,
Everything on the floor, silky smooth passing, fast, incisive. Alan Hinton in those white boots out on the wing,
absolutely.
putting into Kevin Hector. Derby and actually, unfortunately for England, that amazing West Germany team from '72 that took England apart at Wembley. They still look now as if they could live with and probably beat a lot of teams in the modern era. So Clough's the football that Derby in particular played was fantastic.
You're right. You mentioned that the white boots there.
Yeah,
Inton and Alan Ball both wore those white boots, and on
yeah,
such muddy
Hummel.
pitches, it was incredible that you could still
Yeah,
see the white
that's right.
boots. On Match of the Day, I remember them painting the penalty spot on the baseball ground. I
Yeah,
think Jerry Daly was stepping up to take the penalty. The pitches that we had in those days, you had an array of teams that could win the league in the 70s. I mean, there's a
yeah,
great book out about Alan Hudson's team, Stoke City, that
yeah.
nearly won the league in
Tony Waddington. Yeah,
75. Absolutely. I mean,
yeah,
Waddington was a Waddington. I mean, I've never met Tony. Um, I've read about Tony, but Alan talks so fondly about Tony. I almost feel that I do know Tony Waddington and the way
yeah,
Tony's brain worked. And if only Tony Waddington was England manager, because he knew how to treat players. Inside
yeah,
forwards, he used to love to bring them from, particularly Man United, with his friend
yeah,
Matt Busby, because he was a Busby baby. He was there at Man United. His career didn't work out. He's manager of Stoke City for 17 seasons. We had longevity of managers.
yeah,
We knew all our managers in the 70s. We didn't
yeah.
change him every season. And when I say
No,
every season, I mean winter, spring, summer, and that's how we do it today. There's some teams that have 3 or 4 managers in one season now.
like Watford. Yeah, that's right. I
Absolutely,
mean,
yeah.
you mentioned about it being a more level playing field, and I think you're right. I mean, I think the '70s is the era of the provincial club. I mean, you've
Yeah,
got Derby and Forest who win the league, and Forest go on to win the European Cup. But you've got teams winning the FA Cup from the second division like Southampton and Sunderland. You've got Ipswich winning it as well. And I think it was more of a level playing field. And I think you've also got a lot of, you mentioned Stoke, a lot of what ifs. I mean,
yep,
you've got the fact that QPR only missed out on the title by 1 point in 1976, haven't you?
yeah.
You've got the Manchester City team of '72 being foiled at the last. There's a lot of what ifs, and I think that adds to the drama of the '70s. But yeah, it was more of a level playing field because in those days teams shared their gate receipts. Rather than the home team keeping them all now, which kind of is swayed in favour of the bigger clubs, isn't it? It's pre-sponsorship, pre-TV deals. So, yeah, it was more of a level playing field. And I think that is probably, as I said at the start, what makes the '70s quite attractive, or '70s football quite attractive to many people even now.
Absolutely, and some of the golden goals that we saw in the 70s, none
Mm.
greater than in 1972 with Ronnie Radford when he
Yes.
scored that wonderful goal. I had the pleasure of Pat Howard's company for a podcast, and
Yeah.
Pat said it whistled over his head, and he said I looked at it and thought it's got half a chance of going in that has. I mean,
Yeah.
and that was John Motson's first game, of course,
Yeah, that's right.
commentating
Yeah,
in
he
the
was a,
Elephant
I think he
game.
was on a, he was a kind of like a trainee with BBC,
Somebody
and
was ill,
I think,
wasn't they?
yeah, yeah, and he got the game because no one else could be bothered to go because
Mm.
it was a replay that had been called off several times,
Yeah.
and Malcolm McDonald always says the game probably shouldn't have been played because the pitch was horrendous, but they had to get on with it and play it, and as Ronnie Radford says, normally his shots ended up in the car park behind the stand.
Mm.
But it is even now a ridiculous shot. I mean, there's footage of it going in from another angle online somewhere from the other side, and it looks even more incredible then because it actually takes fully 2 or 3 seconds to hit the back of the net.
Yeah,
It's
still
so
rising.
perfectly,
Yeah.
yeah, no,
Mm.
it's so perfectly struck. Ian McFall in the goal he's never going to get near it. Malcolm McDonald's in the other half. And he said from the way even Ronnie Radford shaped to shoot, he just thought he got no chance of saving that putt to Ian McFall. But it's probably, I think, probably the 70s moment, certainly from an FA Cup point of view, that win, because, it's everything that people perhaps think 70s football was. You've got the mud, you've got the English winter, you've got the packed terraces, you've got the friendly pitch invasion. I mean, pitch invasions in the 70s were not always friendly by any means. Yeah. So it's almost like an idyll of what people think English football used to be like, and maybe for that afternoon it was perfect.
Absolutely, and we had minor strikes and we had 3-day weeks, and I think the
Yeah.
game was played during the day because we couldn't put the floodlights on during the night because of the power cuts, etc. The fact
That's
that
right.
Hereford might not have had proper floodlights. I mean, in modern times, you probably have 4 Ford Fiestas at each corner, and they'd probably give you more light than what the floodlights would back in those days. But
well,
I mean,
in the next round when Hereford played West Ham,
yes.
they had a replay. Yeah, they drew 0-0 at Edgar Street. They played West Ham in a midweek replay, and people expected one man and his dog to turn up. It's 42,000 there.
Yeah.
I mean, Nick Hornby wrote in Fever Pitch that when Arsenal played Derby in an FA Cup replay, again, Nick Hornby thought I was the only one there. Arsenal pulled in 62,000.
Yeah.
And Nick Hornby was like, why isn't everyone at work?
Yeah.
No wonder the country's going to the dogs, kind of thing. So yeah, those midweek replays it came about because of the miners' strikes. There was a shortage of coal, and so yeah, they had to cut back on energy output. It's interesting.
And Santos as well, they played at Sheffield Wednesday, and there was a similar amount of fans there at Wednesday that day as there was at Villa Park. We had American teams like the New York Cosmos, the Tampa Bay Rowdies. They'd come over and they'd play games in the 70s. So even over in America with the NASL, they'd come over and they would tour. And it wasn't just the English game. It was a global game back then. It was almost like, do you remember Kerry Packer's Flying Circus when he invented the one-day internationals? It was the football equivalent of all of that rolled into one, and it was just a pioneering, groundbreaking decade.
Yeah, no, it was. I mean,
tracksuits as well in finals. What was all that about?
In what, sorry? Purple
tracksuits in finals. 1974, if you look at it. Malcolm come out, they got purple tracksuit tops. Yeah. That was because one of the directors had got a sports shop and they couldn't flog them.
Yeah, the vivid colours. I mean, Rodney Marsh said that when he appeared in his first Manchester derby at Man United, the City subs, or he was sub on the bench. He warmed up in a banana yellow tracksuit designed by Malcolm Allison, which, as you can imagine, got a lot of attention off the Stretford end. But then Manchester City won, and Rodney Marsh scored, which kind of silenced them. But yeah, the flamboyance of the swagger the 70s. You know, not afraid to experiment in that way, definitely.
And Manchester United get relegated in the 70s as well. What was all that about? I mean, they'd won the European Cup in '68, and then six seasons after, they're getting relegated. It was a decade where literally anything and everything could happen. And did.
Because, I mean, yeah, in the mid-70s, I mean, yeah, as you say, Man United went down in part because, you know, Matt Busby perhaps allowed that 68 European Cup when he seemed to age, and you know, George Best went off the rails. You know, he said he just got fed up with the fact that, you know, Charlton and Law and the others were aging, and he got fed up. But you know, Busby left, and then because he was direct to the newer managers like Franco Farrell, you know, felt intimidated. But in the mid 70s, you've got you know, Arsenal and Tottenham. I mean, Tottenham went down. Arsenal were in relegation dogfights for 2 years in a row. It was a real topsy-turvy, bizarre decade.
And I love the chapter in your book as well, The Superstars. What a series that was. I know it wasn't football, but it was football players. And it really showed how the footballers, I wouldn't say were unfit, but the cyclists and like judo, Brian Jacks, of course, was so successful. But Malcolm done well, Kevin Keegan done well. Stan Bowles only took part for a bet.
Oh,
sorry, you still there?
Oh, sorry, you cut out for a sec. Sorry.
I was like, and Stan Bowles only took part for a bet. Literally, I mean, he couldn't swim, he couldn't run, he couldn't canoe, he couldn't shoot a gun. In fact, he shot the table, didn't he? Bless him.
He famously got the lowest score ever in Superstars of 8 marks, shot a hole in the table, and then ended up torpedoing in his canoe Malcolm McDonald, whom he'd never got on with anyway, and they got on even worse after that, and they both sank. And you know, famously at the end, Stan Bowles promised the woman in charge of the athletes, if you could decline, or the superstars, if his Stan Bowles was a superstar, that he'd do better next time. And the woman pointedly said, "There won't be a next time, Mr. Bowles."
But again,
and that was the end of his superstar's career.
But that was Stanley. I mean, no greater maverick on the pitch and off the pitch than Stan Bowles in the 70s. And that QPR team was one of the great entertaining sides, wasn't it? I think that season when they narrowly, because at the end of the football season, they were top of the pile, but Liverpool had got to go to Wolves a couple of seasons prior. Leeds had got to go to Wolves in 72, but it was different dynamics when Liverpool went there, wasn't it?
Well, that's it. I mean, that shows that in the 70s, in the end, perhaps pragmatism wins out over flair. I mean, that QPR team, and I mentioned earlier that Derby and West Germany were very easy on the ice. So was that QPR team with Bowles and Jerry Francis and Dave Thomas, you know, who always play with his socks rolled down on the wing. And they were wonderfully entertaining. In the end, though, Liverpool, you know, were dogged and kept going. And I think that, you know, David Fairclough helped them quite a lot to win the league that year. There were a lot of 0-0s or potential 0-0s, which Fairclough turned with late goals, and that's where he started to get the nickname Super Sub before he really cemented it against Saint Etienne in the European Cup the next year. But that's it. That's that. You could almost say that sums up the 70s. QPR being pipped by Liverpool, pragmatism perhaps winning out over flair, ultimately.
Absolutely. I love the chapter as well, the Black Pioneers, because there was an element of racism. There's a great book out there, the Black Pioneers as well, by Bill Glaze, and the other fella's name escapes me.
I've got it.
But another great time for, not so much off the pitch, because they did take a lot of stick, but Cyril in particular stared down a racist, didn't they, and changed the mindset of a lot of idiots that was giving the boys such aggravation and stick. They were throwing bananas on the pitch. Some of the songs that they were throwing at them was awful. I have to say, I didn't see anything as a kid at Birmingham City, my team. I didn't see any form of racism there. And then Birmingham famously had a gang that started in the early 80s that was one of the first multicultural hooligan gangs. But Birmingham has always been a city that's embraced multiculturalism, and West Bromwich Albion and Big Ron, of course, had the 3 degrees.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, the abuse that the relatively small number of black players went through in the 70s was horrendous. And yeah, I mean, with Cyril Regis, I was lucky enough to speak to Cyril when he was in Fine Fettle a few years back. And what he said is that the black players in that era, there was no kind of network. There was no one to kind of complain to about the treatment, because that was life. They had to just get on with it and almost like turn the other cheek. And I think that famously West Brom, who were kind of briefly in the winter of '78, perhaps, English football's big thing, as the NME described them. They played this amazing game at Old Trafford against Man U, where West Brom won 5-3. A fantastic display of football by Atkinson's West Brom, and Laurie Cunningham cuts in from the left, and the abuse he's getting from the fans is just deafening from Man United fans. But it's Gerald Sinstadt who actually is the first TV commentator to call out the racists. And he starts to say the abuse the black players are receiving, and then he stops because Tony Browne scores, but he talks about the lack of sportsmanship there. But that's very, very unusual for the time, because it was just that was football. And Brendan Batson said that when he joined West Brom, he thought that the abuse would die down, because he's playing in the top flight now, and he says all that happens is it gets louder. I guess the idea of a multicultural Britain to some people in the 70s was just not going to happen. They wouldn't have it. And the sight of 3 black players playing for West Brom was as Batson said, just obviously too much for some people. That is the sad reflection on where Britain was in the 70s, I think.
Absolutely, and that Football's Black Pioneers by Bill Hearn and David Gleave.
That's it, Gleave,
fantastic
Good
read.
book, great book.
And I love the bit about Millwall as well, because lots of people always perceive Millwall to be a bit of a rogue set of supporters, but they really embrace their black players. And over the road at Chelsea, of course, they didn't, did they?
No. I mean, I spoke to Phil Walker and Trevor Lee, who were at Millwall in the 70s. And, again, Walker and Lee, Phil Walker said to me, well, we had all the abuse hurled at us at a non-league level. We thought we might as well get paid for it.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing, the kind of situation that black players found themselves in. But, yeah, Millwall fans fully embraced Walker and Trevor Lee, because they were very much wholehearted players, and the boys said they fitted in straight away there. And I think it's an interesting story, because obviously Millwall fans have in the 70s their reputations as hooligans, with Harry the dog and everyone else, as shown in the Panorama documentary, comes across. But yet they did take Walker and Lee to their hearts. So it's a story which I thought was worth telling, because I'm not sure that many people know about that.
Absolutely. They took their first black player, Frankie Peterson, to heart as well, who didn't play for long, but was a tremendous football player, a friend of Barry Silkman, and Silky tells a wonderful story of Frankie Peterson. But yeah, I mean, even the TV program.
Frank Peterson, he had did you know that he had a walk-on part in the movie of Porridge?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
I was just going to talk about that, because.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for butting in there.
No, we had like Porridge.
As to when we can get that story in.
We had Porridge. We had On the Buses, because Bob McNabb, again, not just in magazines, but they were in prominent comedy programs like Porridge and On the Buses, and 2 of the biggest programs that we had in the 70s. Footballers involved in that.
No, definitely, absolutely. I mean, it's yeah. I mean, I think Bob McNabb, as you say, he was supposed to be with a team. They never ended up playing, did they? In the end, I think he had a McNabb wasn't in action in it, but he was in on the buses, wasn't he?
Yes, he was on the
And
buses. Yeah,
and you've
definitely.
got all the
Mm,
links to
yeah.
football in Porridge as well, especially about Mackay. Alluding to Dave Mackay, but obviously there the joke's aimed at Mr. Mackay, the prison warder. So yeah, comedy and football, as well as music and football, have quite a lot of links in the 70s as well. Because Malcolm McDonald was mentioned on a couple of occasions in the Likely Lads, wasn't he?
Yeah, well, they had that scenario in the Likely Lads on the one episode where England was playing and they didn't want to know the score,
Yeah,
didn't they?
that's right.
And
That's right.
iconic. But even Pike in Dad's Army, Aston Villa, wasn't he? You got the Villa scarf, Pike. Don't tell him your name, Pike. And then,
Yeah,
of course, we had Alf Garnett as well with the West Ham.
yeah,
Again, having a go at the racists, but a lot of people thought that Alf Garnett, Warren Mitchell, was a racist, but he was so clever,
yeah.
it was a mirror effect. And when I was saying about Chelsea, they had Paul Cannaville that made his debut, and he was warming up against, I think it was Crystal Palace, and got such a volley of abuse turned around. It was his own supporters.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. It's a different age. I mean, I'm hoping to speak to Paul Cannaville for the '80s follow-up. Actually,
Mm-hmm.
so hopefully I'll reach out to him soon as well. But yeah, I mean, yeah, what the black players go through in that era is truly shocking, isn't it?
It is, and when you look at it, it was only 50 years ago. So, we're not talking about, the dark ages or, when I don't know, the Ice Age or something that's hundreds and thousands of years ago. We're talking about something that's pretty much on our doorstep, and colour
Mm.
television had just come out. It's, what was happening in that decade was quite incredible and extraordinary. And FA Cup semi-finals, of course, were at neutral venues in the 70s,
Yeah.
not at Wembley Stadium.
No, that's right. Either at Villa Park or Hillsborough.
Yeah.
Where yeah, that's right. Neutral. No, yeah, that's right. I mean, again, some would say that was better, in it kept Wembley more kind of more precious and more pure. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, you were. How many players did you actually talk to? Because in your acknowledgements, I'm looking there and
Yeah,
I'm like, wow, Colin Addison, Alan Ball, Brendan Batson, Kevin Beattie, The Beat, Georgie Best, Dan Bowles, Ian Bowyer. I mean, the
yeah.
list is absolutely incredible.
I
It's like
think
a
I
who's
spoke to
who's of
about
football,
50.
isn't it? Yeah, it's
Yeah, it was
phenomenal.
about 50. I was very lucky to speak to. Well, you mentioned, George Best. I interviewed him in 2004. It was a year after he'd had his liver transplant, and he was actually as well as he was at any time, I guess, later in life. He was
Mm,
obviously frail and fragile, but he'd lost a lot of the puff he had around his face when he was
yeah,
drinking. And he actually looked, quite a lot like the handsome athlete that blazed a trail in football in the 60s. And he was amazing. I found George Best very quite sort of beguiling company, because I thought that George Best was very, very bright, but
yeah, clever.
wired differently to
Mm,
anyone else I'd ever spoken to as a footballer. I think I found out later he got approached by Mensa because he had a very high IQ.
yeah, it's
And
clever.
when I met him, he was doing these these cryptic crossword puzzles. I didn't have a bloody clue
Yeah,
what the responses were, and this advanced Sudoku. I thought, blimey! So he was like a problem solver, and that probably reflected how he was on the pitch. He could, very quickly solve problems in his head, which I guess you have to do as a footballer. You see things differently. But I think that he just said what struck me was he said that everything he enjoyed about the fame and the football in the 60s, he just stopped enjoying by the
yeah.
early 70s. I think he got world weary of everything very, very quickly.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because Alan Hudson says that George was such a clever, such a bright lad. They never
Yeah,
exchanged telephone numbers, But when George had moved down to London, his pub was just on the King's Road there, and George had his pub, Alan had his pub, and they'd, go and see each other, have a drink together, and he said he'd just go through the crossword. Very, very clever lad. And
very clever.
And football songs as well, of course. I mean, it started in 1970 with Back Home, and probably ended in 79, didn't it? With, or 70, 77, 78, with We've Got the Whole World in Our Hands, with Nottingham Forest.
Yeah, I mean, Back Home is the first football record to go to number one. Sold in a huge number of copies, and it was Bill Martin's idea, a Scot. That didn't go down very well with Alf Ramsey, who was notoriously A, anti-Scottish, and B, notoriously anti-show business. And it was his boys of '66 that turned him around to it, and said it might be fun, and they loved it. They used to sing it on the way to the games, and Jack Charlton asked him if Ramsey was going to sing it, and he said, "I'm not singing that bloody racket." You can imagine Alf saying it now, can't you?
Yeah.
But The Whole World in Their Hands was by Paper Lace,
wasn't it?
a Nottingham band, and that also was very, very popular at the time as well. And I can still got the song in my head these days as well.
And Blue is the Colour, probably my favourite football song of all time, the 1972 League Cup final, because we didn't just have the Cup, the FA Cup, we had the League Cup, and again, an array of different winners of the League Cup. It wasn't the age of a monopoly on trophies.
No.
We've said that earlier in the podcast. We had a lot of teams that won, and I'd, without looking, probably say that was the last decade where football was scattered around the winners' enclosures, because we certainly had that in the 50s, we had it in the 40s, and you would have had it before as well. But I think from the 80s onwards, I think if we drew up how many winners of various cup competitions that we had, home and abroad, I think the winners' enclosure would be shrinking.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think by the end of the 70s, I mean, Liverpool is starting to dominate in terms of the league. But as you say, in the 80s, there are fewer winners of the FA Cup and the league, and obviously that trajectory carries on into the 90s and beyond. So it goes back to what we were saying, wasn't it, about it being a level playing field.
So although they were pioneers, they were trailblazers, they were the last generation as well. Again, all-encompassing, that decade. And I don't think there's been another decade like it, and never will be another decade, because you're not going to get the stories of the players. Did any of the players tell you some fantastic stories? I mean, I do at the end of our podcast, Tales that Mavericks Tell, and some of the stories are absolutely phenomenal. The guys got up to all sorts. You don't have it today.
No, that's right. I mean, I think what makes it such a creative decade, in the sense you're saying, is that you, as I say, you've got colour TV, which elevates football, but there's the fact that the guys don't earn a fortune means they're accessible to everyone. So Revie, Don Revie, as we said earlier, gets approached by Bert Patrick Madden. He just walks in and sees him. You've got Paul Trevelyan just turns up and meets him. I mean, these days you've got so much security and agents surrounding players, you'd never get that level of access. And that's what I found writing this book. I mean, you mentioned how many players I was lucky enough to interview, because the guy's just out there. I mean, for this book, Rodney Marsh, I just DM'd him on Twitter. It was back within half an hour. I mean, Rodney Marsh, blimey. Imagine, say the equivalent of Jack Grealish today. Imagine just DMing Jack Grealish on Twitter.
You got no
and then
chance.
coming, whenever you want. So, and George Best, I just basically went to the Theme pub in Chelsea and sat and waited for him. And the barman goes, "He'll be in a bit." And there he was, in for half an hour, and he got to speak to him. And it's the last generation where you would be able to do that. Definitely.
Absolutely.
And what that means is that you can get a real kind of cross-fertilization of ideas in a way that you couldn't possibly get today.
Yeah, absolutely. And players that had testimonials, of course, in those days. And when you look at the amount of appearances that players played for a certain club, you could almost name the 1 to 11. I mean, I'll give you a great example. Steve Perryman, how many, I know he's Tottenham and the North London rivalry, but I mean, how many games did Steve Perryman play for the Spurs? You wouldn't
Yeah.
get that again today, would you? You couldn't get it.
No, you wouldn't. That's yeah. I mean, you get occasional examples like Tony Adams at Arsenal and Paul Scholes and stuff like that,
Yeah.
but it's getting increasingly rare, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's been a fantastic trip down memory lane, and I thank you so much, Jon, for your time. It's a fantastic read, a lovely book.
By.
Oh, it absolutely does. What's the easiest way that people, because ultimately what we want people to do is buy the book, because it is a fantastic book, and it's a thick book as well. The thing that I love with books is that you own it, and it's there. It's a work of art. Without books and podcasts, the game and all the memories and the awards and the goal scoring charts, they all seem to erode over time. It's like the sea going over on the pebbles and it just washes them away, and it's something that should never happen. And with books like yours, and podcasts as well, and talking to players and getting the memories about those halcyon days of the golden decade of football, the memories never die. So thank you very much, sir, for this. It's monumental, and I'm looking forward to your
Pleasure. Thank you.
1980s book as well.
Yes, that will be out in a couple of years. But you said the best way to get hold of it. Well, it's available from all the normal outlets, be they online or it's in Waterstones as well. But it's on Amazon, it's on the Hive, it's on Smith's, Waterstone. So it's everywhere. Hopefully where people can get hold of it who want it.
And how can people hook up with you and say, Jon, that was a fantastic read, I absolutely loved it?
Yeah. The best way is Twitter. So I'm on Twitter at Jon Spurling 1.
Can I thank you again, sir? It's been an absolute pleasure, a joy, and an honour to talk about it was the beautiful game, and we didn't even get to talk about the World Cups, of course, because the Dutch did play the beautiful game. They played total football.
They did.
Yeah, and we just had everything in the 70s.
We did.
In abundance.
Absolutely.
And it's just
good,
fantastic.
bad, and ugly.
Absolutely, and that was a film as well, of course, wasn't it? Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid,
That's right, that's right.
It's been a pleasure, a joy. Thank you so much, and we will reconvene when in a couple of years' time when you do your 80s book, because I'll be looking forward to reading that as well.
Thank you very much.
Cheers, Jon. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Cheers.
And thanks for listening, guys. Cheers. Good night.
Cheers.
The living room is where you make life's most beautiful memories. But your sofa shouldn't be the one remembering them. The new life-resistant, high-performance furniture collection from Ashley is designed to withstand all the spills, slip-ups, and muddy paws that come with the best parts of life. Ashley high-performance sofas and recliners are soft, on-trend, and easy to clean. Shop the high-performance furniture in-store or online at ashley.com. Ashley, for the love of home.